Many strange occurrences have been happening in the Cascade Mountains, specifically Mount Shasta, for quite some time, but it is California, so they're pretty much up to no good out there anyways. While a beautiful hiking destination for thousands of people each year, one of the things about this place and the Cascade Range specifically is that people have been warning one another not to go too close to it, especially, again, Mount Shasta, for quite some time, and this dates all the way back to the native Klamath people. While most likely told to the young of the tribe so that they just wouldn't, wander off and be eaten by some sort of animal, this is something that persists all throughout humanity, using stories to basically keep the younger population from just wandering around, because that's kind of what we tend to do. The story goes that giants actually lived within the mountain, and this actually happened when the spirit Kel descended from the heavens to go fight Lao on a neighboring mountain of Mazam. They would actually throw rocks at each other and lava, and this was likely during this time frame, explaining the volcanic activity that was happening on the mountains during this time. However, what is interesting is, even though that was supposed to deal with the fact that there were spirits coming down and they were fighting and all this, the giants aspect was something that was added in by these people for reasons unknown, and they also said along the Pacific coast that there were just giants that populated the entire area. Other strange occurrences began to crop up as well, especially during the 1800s when everybody was heading out there, that there was a series of complex tunnels that existed within the mountain range that could be accessed via certain points. Now, the interesting thing is, this was supposed to be a lost continent that existed just south of India, and its name was Lemuria, and apparently these people were well beyond what normal humans were capable of that point. It kind of goes in line with like Atlantis, how for some reason a super advanced section of humanity just somehow went missing, and we have no idea what happened to it. Although if you take the 1950s, for instance, from then on, our technology has increased tenfold. And then some people also say that's because of Atlantis or possibly Lemuria. Now, we know Lemuria does not actually exist because of plate tectonics. However, there is New Zealandia, I believe it is. New Zealand is part of a sunken continent, and that is just the one piece of the continent that is actually above the water. It's pretty interesting. If you haven't looked at that, you should check it out. Now, the reason people thought these were humans is because they would actually appear with white robes on at the top of the mountains, although nobody really interacted with them, and then they would apparently descend back into the mountain. So, what is that exactly? Well, we're going to try to figure that out in today's episode, because I have no clue either, so let's go. So the postulations of these cave systems, or at least these intentional tunnels running all throughout the mountain, is pretty interesting, because as early as like 2008, there was actually a man, let me look at his name, named Elijah Sullivan, who was very familiar with the mountain, who actually stumbled across a section of the mountain that had been dug out. It was a 60-foot deep hole that appeared to have been dug by hand using a system of pulleys that basically they went in there in the middle of the night because he had been there the day prior. The hole wasn't there. He came back. The hole was there. 60 feet straight down, they found a water bottle, buckets, and pulleys, as well as a ladder. But they didn't find anybody else, and they have no idea why anybody would have dug this hole. And still, there are even other things that seem to kind of add to the validity of possibly some underground structure within Mount Shasta. And this was was discovered anyways, by a man by the name of J.C. Brown. Essentially, he was looking for gold. He was a British prospector, and when he came across a cave, he went in, and he said he went down 11 miles, which I think is like around 16 kilometers or something like that. Went down there and actually found a village, as well as gold, shields, weapons, basically everything that would indicate that there was human habitation, or at least something habitation in there, in the area. So as far as like the tunnels were confirmed or concerned, he was able to find something. Now, take that with a grain of salt, because he would go on to tell somebody later, and then this whole thing kind of went awry. So upon coming back to the surface, he would actually go and tell a man by the name of John C. Root about the things he had found, including mummies that were over 10 feet tall. So this obviously would have piqued his interest, or it would have piqued Root's interest. So being an exploring person himself, he got together 80 men who were supposed to go down there to check this thing out, using Brown as a sort of guide to kind of go and, see where he went. Now, during the morning that they were supposed to go down there, 80 people arrived. However, Brown would not arrive to go show them. And on top of that, it was like, okay, well, not only did he not show up, but he was never heard from again, which is a little strange, considering, maybe he had family or something like that. It's not really known, but Yeah, that was the whole thing. He just never showed back up. So the mysteries surrounding Mount Shasta have continued to perplex and alarm people as time has gone on, and they only get weirder also as time goes on. So you really have to wonder if there actually is something beneath the surface of the mountain. So also something to realize though is during the initial timeline, or at least the beginning, things may have gotten a little muddied and lost in communication between the native people that lived there and then the people coming through because of Manifest Destiny, mainly because communication wasn't even really that great between the two groups. It unfortunately did happen that way. It just is what it is. But what they were told was enough to kind of make the people who were coming in a little concerned about what they were walking into, and hey, at least they got somewhat of a warning. But what was most interesting is it appears as though the people who may not have been told or warned would also come to very similar conclusions about what was happening on that mountain just by being around it. And these are events that still seem to happen to this day. One such event led to the dumbfoundedness of the parents and grandparents alike, as a pre-adult by the name of John Doe would go missing but then turn back up, and then based on the grandmother's experiences, which we will talk about later, it seemed like something was either plaguing this family or just in general was plaguing the area. So it's no surprise to anybody who's been online for at least 10 minutes, or me who's terminally online because it's like my job or something, that national park disappearances do happen quite a bit. And when they do happen, or well, when they regularly happen, it seems like, most people are never found again. Now, a lot of people are found, but it's usually not an ideal condition that they're found in. The people that do actually get found alive are always very scattered and freaked out, obviously, because they've been in the wilderness. But a lot of people, when they go missing, they just straight up do not come back. Tragically, it does appear like people who are lower on the age scale do appear to just, when they go missing, they just go missing. There's nothing ever found of them again. But it is also just as likely for adults to straight up vanish out in the wilderness. And even national park officers have gone missing, never to be seen again. These stories will typically play out the same every single time. The person turns their back for just a few seconds, whoever was behind them just vanishes, completely vaporizes, never to be seen again. And no matter how hard they look, no matter how they search, it could be helicopters, planes, thermal imaging, anything, nothing is ever found. No noise, no warning, no signs, no heads up, just a missing person. However, this story in particular is, I think, more interesting because the person does get found, but what they say kind of raises more questions than it answers, and we'll just have to go through it because it's a pretty wild ride. On October 1st, 2010, and some say actually it was at the end of September, a young pre-adult who had only revolved around the sun 3.5 times would go on to go missing near a popular fly fishing spot that his family was camping at. And you're probably wondering why I have to use all this stupid terminology. It's because in my Missing 411 video, I used a word one time. Okay, actually I think it was 6 times. And it has to do with pre-adults. And my comments got auto-disabled. And it took 2 months to turn them back on, even talking to YouTube directly. So I don't do that anymore. I just find ways around it. So here we are. Welcome to the show. And not to mention, with the whole age restriction bot completely losing its mind right now, it's best just not to tread down that line. So this popular fly fishing spot that they were at, it was his parents, his grandparents, and also his dog, John's dog, as they were all sitting there together, having a good time, whatever you do as a family unit. The youngling would go missing because the parents turned their back for 1 minute, and they said when they looked back, him and the dog were both gone. So just like all stories, he was there 1 second and just gone the next, which again is standard. Now, as you might imagine, this would alarm the parents, so they would take off running, looking for their son. They would call his name and they would call the dog's name, but neither would return back to them. So as they searched for hours for him, and the night started getting later and later, eventually the dad would end up calling law enforcement as well as National Park Ranger Services to get a search team out there to start looking for him everywhere, because, the more time that passes, especially with people who are, smaller on the age scale and smaller in general, you've got animals out there, you've got dangers such as falling off cliffs and rocks and boulders, and you've got a lot of stuff that can take you out, especially when you are that age. So after a few hours of searching with the larger group, eventually they would find the dog, but it didn't paint a good picture. The dog was curled up on the banks of the river, shivering because obviously it had gone in the rapids and barely pulled itself out. So the rapids were dangerous enough. They could take down a full-grown adult pretty easily. I don't know if you've ever been in rapids. I almost drowned in one, I think when I was 18 years old. So it happens. Life jackets don't actually help as much as you think, especially basically what happens in rapids, and this is totally off topic, but you're already here and I'm here. When you go into rapids, air has been mixed up with the water to the point that when you go to swim, you don't actually go up. You have to get into actual water for your life jacket to work properly, so you'll just sink. And that happened to me during a specific area that kind of curls back in on itself, so I almost wasn't here talking to you. That would have sucked. But as they kept searching, the parents became increasingly desperate, and also the searchers were like, ooh, this is not really a good situation, mainly because if this person if they did fall into the rapids, likely they already drowned and there is no getting him back, and they're just gonna have to keep searching along the embankments, or he could be caught up underneath a log or a rock, never to be seen again. But in a desperate attempt, they would bring in dogs to try and search for him, which one would actually get his scent. Hiding in a bush, shivering at around 12:45 a.m., they would find him, much to the parents' relief and search and rescuers alike, but he was in a semi-conscious state, just completely out of it, and just totally exhausted. Now, the parents obviously are like, okay, well, he's exhausted because of what he's been through. I mean, there's no telling where he's been, so they didn't really question too much, but his consciousness or his conscious state was a little interesting given the circumstances. Concluding that the search was a success, everybody would high-five and then head home for a job well done and some sleep. Now, they went home and life would continue on like normal. However, some strange retellings of events would start to come out as time went on. Roughly 3 weeks later, while at his grandma's house, he would unprompted say that he actually prefers this grandma over his other grandma. If your grand offspring say something like that, it's a little strange, as you might guess. But perplexed by this, she would ask him, well, what do you mean? So at this point, Joe would go on to answer this by saying that when he was lost, he actually started following a woman who he thought was his grandmother. And upon following her, she led him into the cave system and then went down pretty deep into the caves. He says while he was leading him down there, he would end up seeing all of these dusty cave systems, but eventually he ended up in a room that was covered in spiders, had purses and force multipliers as well as other weapons on the floor. But the most alarming thing that he said he saw was that the walls were lined with humanoid-looking robots, but he didn't know what they actually were. They looked human, but even as a young adult, he knew they weren't human. He stated also around this time that as he turned and looked at his grandmother, there was light radiating from her head that made her seem like she was a robot. And then at one point, apparently how she climbed the ladder within the cave system also indicated to him that he was a robot. Now, what's interesting about kind of what is a robot to somebody who doesn't understand human movement, I guess you could say. So typically with humans, we have very fluid movements, even though some of us are clumsy, but you can kind of tell. And this is what's called the uncanny valley effect. Now, uncanny valley means something looks almost human, but it's not human, right? And there's a couple of ideas based on what the uncanny valley effect is. Now, it could be based on the fact that back in the day, there were humanoid-looking creatures like us. I mean, you have Neanderthalensis that was not sapiens. It was a different form. It was in the same genus as us, but not the same species. So if you take something like that, it's a way for our species to recognize humans as opposed to something that looks almost human but isn't. And it's a way to kind of make sure potentially interbreeding doesn't happen between, say, you and, I don't know, an orangutan or something. However, with Neanderthal, it was apparently human enough, so we accidentally bred them out of existence. In fact, actually, I have 60% more DNA than average of Neanderthal DNA. Awesome. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. The point is that our brains can recognize something that looks somewhat human but isn't human. In fact, in the future, if we do create cyborgs, we're going to have to not really get over ourselves, but figure out how to make something that looks human, that isn't human, act human, and behave like a human. Otherwise, it'll creep our brains out. Or we could just not create something like that. That sounds good too. But, of course, we're humans, so we're going to do it. Screw it. AI, Skynet, Microsoft, guy in his basement yelling about it, all of it checks out. So anyways, the uncanny valley effect is fairly interesting because it might cause John to actually call this a robot when really it's behaving like a human, but it's not human. But then this thing would make a very odd request of him that was absolutely not human. It handed him a piece of paper and asked him to defecate on it. Why? Well, it depends on who you ask. So if you're going with the concept that this is definitely an alien pretending to be a human, then it might just be something as simple as discovering genetics or making sure the person is infected with something. Because just like in medical situations now, the number one way to figure out what's wrong with you is to take a stool sample. God help me, I don't know why that's the case, but it just is. So after making this request out of John and John just saying, no, I'm good, it would start to get kind of agitated and aggressive with him until finally it became so upset that he wasn't going to comply with this order that it just gave up entirely, but then it moved on to a very strange topic that it would tell him. It would ask him to lay down on a table where it would examine his stomach, and then it told him that you're actually not from Earth, you were planted in your mother's womb from space. Now, why? That's a very good question. Does anybody know the motives of aliens, if aliens do exist? I don't think so. Well, maybe like one guy in the government, but that's about it. So from here, the conversation between John and his grandmother becomes a little more chaotic, and not much is known about what was said. So around this time, whatever this thing was, if it did exist at all, probably became annoyed by John, so it took him back outside and left him by a bush, telling him to stay there and wait until help arrived, and then just walked off. So obviously this would be a little strange to the grandmother, so she called up John's father and said, hey, what have you been allowing this youngling to watch? Because he's got a really weird story about what happened. And the dad would confirm that just after they had found John, that he had told him the same thing. But, he's like, oh, it's just a youngling. Don't pay attention, it's just their imagination is going wild. Well, that would be all well and good, but the interesting aspect about this is it wasn't just John who experienced something weird out there, but other people actually, just prior, had their own problems, including the grandmother. The grandmother, who apparently was spry and tech savvy, which is not impossible, but just usually not what happens, would go onto a tech forum, not really a tech forum, but would go on a forum and then talk about what had happened to her personally on Mount Shasta. Which, before getting to her story, I just want to point out something. If what happens to her had ever happened to me, either I would just chalk it up to I partied way too hard the night before, or it would be such a red flag of an area that I would never return, and I would also probably tell my family to never return either. So apparently this is how the story goes. The grandmother was out camping with a friend just the year prior, and when she was out there, night falls, whatever, you got your fire, good to go. Well, she heard something off in the woods, so she shined her flashlight and saw a couple pairs of red eyes. So at the time, she didn't think anything of it because she's like, oh, it just must be like a group of deer. Deer with their red eyes, then their forward-facing eyes as well. Totally normal. So the grandma would go to bed for the night after witnessing that, get into her sleeping bag, close her tent, and then go to sleep. Well, unbeknownst to her, and for, what she can assume is just some ethereal reason, she woke up the next morning face down on the ground with 2 puncture marks in her neck. Now either she totally forgot about that keg stand she did the night before, or if she was completely sober, then this would be highly alarming. So when she woke up, the puncture marks were obviously causing quite a bit of pain. Assuming it to just be a spider bite, she didn't really think much of it until her friend actually came out of their tent and had the same 2 puncture marks, and they were both in quite a bit of pain. Now, afterwards, they said that they were trying to pack up, and they just felt completely lethargic, like something was obviously wrong, like they were sick. And I've slept outside before, face down in the dirt as well, and I was violently ill, but it wasn't because of puncture marks. But after this had kind of come to a conclusion, I guess you could say, once they had packed up and left, she started to remember other things, that there were no animals, no insects, no noise whatsoever in the woods while they were out there. And I'm beginning to feel like the only people this stuff happens to are those who just blatantly ignore every warning sign in an area, right? And then you have to ignore that little piece of your brain that says, hey, this doesn't appear to be safe. You just have to throw caution to the wind. So maybe that's the key to finding such horrible things such as wendigos and skinwalkers and I don't know, Headless Valley and all of these things is you have to ignore the instincts that have kept all of your ancestors alive all throughout history so that you could be the result of this and just say, nope, I'm not going to pay attention to it. And then boom, you see something terrible. So she said after she got home, she was overcome with a state of depression where all of her creativity, all of her emotions just appeared to be drained away. And she had no clue what was happening. And it took several months for her to apparently get back to where she used to be. So at this point, she would not press John any further for information because she didn't want to install false memories in his head about what had happened by asking leading questions, which is a very real thing if you didn't know. So she just kind of left it alone, and then they moved on past that. But this was like 15 years ago, and if John at that time was the age that he was, that means John's an adult now. So John, if you're watching this, go ask your grandma some questions. Although John isn't really your name, so you could be anybody. It doesn't really matter. But if you went to Mount Shasta as a very, very young adult, then yeah, go ask your grandma about what happened. Now, there are a few ways to approach this. In life, you should generally have a healthy amount of skepticism towards what's actually happening because you don't know people's mental status. You don't know if they were drinking. You don't know if there was something else going on because it's California. There could have been quite a few things. The parents, obviously, I turned around for 1 minute, he's gone. There's no guarantee that they were even watching anyone in the first place. So I know I sound like a glowy, which it just is what it is, but you always want to be skeptical of these types of things. I'm glad it came out good, but that doesn't mean everything went down 100% as stated. And I mean, even if you take the Native American lore on the area and beliefs about what happened, there is a common theme actually that appears all throughout Native American, doesn't matter what tribe. Essentially, you will have gods come down and gods come up and they battle, and it was used as a metaphor to explain kind of natural disasters and natural issues that were going on. In fact, there is a similar story, I think it's Crater Lake actually, where the crater, or the actual little island in Crater Lake, was created by a god coming down from the heavens, fighting an underworld god, creating that area, and I believe drowning the underworld god, if I remember correctly. I might have got that part wrong. But again, the whole point is there are similar themes throughout where these will kind of explain what's happening in the natural world. But also, to have skepticism is to understand that if you weren't there, you also don't know everything that happened. So humans have been trying to explain things that we don't understand using metaphors for quite a while, and it doesn't even have to be, natural disasters. There are things in Earth's history that simply have happened that there's like paintings of it, or there are references to it, and in today's day, it's lost because we don't know the meaning behind it, but at the time, they knew what the meaning was, they knew what the meaning was and what it was supposed to mean, which is exactly the same sentence over again. The point is that while it's good to be skeptical of things that do happen, things may have happened as described. But also, you do have to take into consideration that a youngling's imagination will go way out there. There's actually a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which essentially takes the idea of trauma, and most people kind of attribute trauma, it's just a mental thing, like I can get over it. But actually your body holds on to it in different ways that you might not think, which can lead, in this case, to like this one, possibly making up some stories as to what he saw. But I will counter that point and say this. I severely doubt John would have just understood that these tunnels were underneath the mountain and in the cave systems unless his parents were originally talking about it. But this also still falls in line with the concept of back in the 1800s, they're like, yeah, there's complex tunnels in there. The Native Americans thought giants lived in there. The one guy who didn't show up for the expedition said he found 10-foot mummies. There are a lot of consistencies throughout this whole thing that would seem completely disconnected if it weren't for a similar story, I guess is the best way to put it. But it's possible also that John was so shaken up by the fact that he was alone in the dark in the woods for that long that his brain kind of made up an imaginary friend to cope with what was happening. And if he liked his grandmother, I mean, it would be kind of common to be like, oh, well, yeah, I'm just going to imagine her here. And imaginary friends for this age range are actually very common. It's actually a healthy coping mechanism for the human brain to do so. So I didn't have any imaginary friends growing up. Probably not healthy. But with skepticism, just remember, it is important to keep an open mind about certain events, especially if there are reoccurring themes that happen throughout, because it may be explaining the same thing. If you look at Mount Shasta, there's very clearly something off about it, and people that go up there find strange things all the time. Again, the 60-foot hole that was randomly dug, the cave system that apparently goes 11 miles beneath the surface of the earth, which I'm pretty sure would cook you alive, because that's pretty deep. The mountains, as far as the fights going on. Then you have things like giants. Then you have people saying they're finding gold and shields and the lost continent of Lemur. The fact is that there are interesting concepts all throughout that may explain the same thing, just from different perspectives. But are there likely people living in a volcanic mountain range at this point in time? I kind of severely doubt it. However, it has to be taken with a grain of salt because A, I haven't been there, but B, I will say, until it's mapped, until we know for a fact what is out there, it's really hard to say with 100% certainty that nothing strange is happening out there. Now, as far as we know with humanity, we haven't found, at least in current era, we haven't found any giants or references to giants or anything like that. Now, it was common back in the day. I mean, even in the Bible, David and Goliath. Goliath was considered a giant, and giants came from angels getting frisky with humans, because why not? So the concept of giants, I'm not really certain why that is a thing all throughout history. There are larger than normal people now. I went to school with a guy back in high school who was 7'1" in 11th grade. Now, he was lanky as all get out, but it was absolutely wild. But ultimately, luckily John Doe was found. It's just his story seems to almost go along with the other stories that have been heard about Mount Shasta. But on this channel, we have 123,000 subscribers. Have you guys ever been to Mount Shasta? Have you ever seen anything strange? If you have, let me know down in the comments because I would like to hear your story on it as well. Also, just wanted to point out that we are moving towards 1 million subs, and 2027, if we do get to 1 million subs, then I will go to Michigan with Wow Such Gaming and probably several other people, and we will try to find the Michigan Dogman because he only comes out on years ending with 7, so just letting you know that. But in the meantime, I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did enjoy, please leave a like. If you hated it, leave a dislike as it's engagement. And if you really enjoyed it and you want to get notified in the future about when I post, consider subscribing as that keeps you up to date on when I post. Again, drop a comment on what you would like me to cover in the future. Let me know. I did this format last time, and I'm really trying to look at the camera more as I write things, well, as it's written. I hope I'm not rambling too much. If I am, then just let me know that. I'm trying to get better at talking in front of the camera, but I hope everybody enjoyed. Let me know what you thought. Did you like this story? Did you not? All that good stuff. Anyhow, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.